I grew up in a small place called Fog City, Montana. It ain't famous for much of anything, really, except for dust, gravel, and a whole mess of trees that seemed to swallow up the sky. My whole world back then was just me and my mom, and she had one rule that was gospel. You don't go near Silas Crowley's place. Not for a dare, not for a shortcut, not for anything. Silas lived in this beat-to-hell trailer on the edge of town, the kind of rusted-out single-wide that looked like a tetanus shot waiting to happen. He made his living, if you could call it that, by rummaging through other people's trash after dark, a ghost in the headlights of passing cars. My mom, she drilled it into me from the time I was old enough to understand words. "He's a monster, baby," she'd say, her voice low and tight like a guitar string about to snap. The reason was simple, a piece of town lore she treated like fact. Silas Crowley had killed someone. Not just anyone either. He'd killed her best friend from high school, and that fact hung over our house like the ever-present dust. The full story didn't come out all at once. It trickled out over years, in bits and pieces, until I was 17. That was the night Mom got into the cheap whiskey a little too heavy. She sat me down at our rickety kitchen table, her breath thick with it, and laid it all out. Her friend, this guy named Mike, was apparently some kind of local hero in her memory. She told me how they were all out by Silver Lake one night, just kids being kids, drinking beer they'd stolen from their dads. Then they saw a figure in the dark, a man carrying what looked like a sack over his shoulder. It was a kid, she said, an unconscious little girl. Mike, being the guy he was, didn't hesitate. He took off after the man, who my mom swore up and down was Silas. He yelled for him to stop, to put the girl down. When Mike caught up to him, the man just dropped the kid like she was nothing, pulled a gun, and fired 4 times. 4. She repeated that number like it was a prayer. Mike died right there on the shore. The little girl, she told me, died later at the hospital. An overdose of tranquilizers. Hearing it all laid out like that, from her, it lit a fire in my gut. My whole life, Silas was this boogeyman, but now he had a face, a crime, and I hated him with a kind of purity only a teenager can feel. That hatred festered for a few weeks, twisting itself into a plan. It wasn't smart, but it felt righteous. I was gonna burn his damn trailer to the ground. Let him feel some of the heat his actions had brought on everyone else. I waited for a moonless night and slipped out, my heart hammering against my ribs. In my backpack, I had a big can of paint thinner I'd swiped from the high school art room during my last period class. The smell of it, sharp and chemical, seemed to fill my lungs with purpose. I cut through the woods, the crunch of pine needles under my boots the only sound, until I reached the clearing that bordered Silver Lake, not far from where his trailer was parked. The place was dead quiet. I could see the outline of his rusty home against the star-dusted sky. I pulled out the can, my hand shaking a little as I started to twist the cap. It was then that I heard it, the single most terrifying sound in the world, the metallic click of a rifle's hammer being pulled back. A voice, raspy and tired, cut through the dark from behind me. "What you got there, son?" I froze solid, the can of thinner feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I turned around slow, and there he was. Silas Crowley. He wasn't the monster I'd pictured. He wasn't big or snarling or crazy-eyed. He was just an old man, skinny, with a face like a road map of every bad road he'd ever been down, wearing a faded flannel jacket. The rifle he held wasn't pointed at my head, but held low, almost casual. "I know who you are," he said, his voice softer now. "You're Sarah's boy." He knew my mom's name. He gestured with the rifle barrel toward his trailer. "Come on inside. It's cold out." I don't know why I did it, but I walked. Inside, it didn't smell like death or evil. It smelled like old coffee and wood smoke. He took the can from me, set it on his counter, and sat down at his own small table, motioning for me to do the same. He looked at me for a long time, his eyes full of a sadness so deep it felt ancient. Then he started to talk, and he told me a story about that night at the lake, a story that was nothing like the one my mother had told me. He said he'd been out hunting squirrels for his supper, a habit he picked up in Vietnam. That's when he saw them, a group of drunk teenagers by the water's edge. And he saw Mike, my mom's friend. He knew Mike, knew he'd been kicked out of school for stealing, knew there were whispers about him cornering girls behind the bleachers. And that night, Mike wasn't chasing a monster, he was the monster. He was the one carrying the little girl, who was already limp and unconscious in his arms. Silas said he could see what was going to happen, plain as day. He yelled at Mike to put the girl down, that it was over. But Mike didn't listen. He pulled a hunting knife from his belt. Silas said he had no choice. He raised his rifle and fired twice, not 4 times like in my mom's story, but 2. 2 shots to the chest. He said he ran over, scooped up the little girl himself, and carried her all the way into town, screaming for someone to call the sheriff. Her parents, Silas said, his voice cracking. They called me a hero, but she died anyway. The drugs they'd given her, it was already too late. I didn't save her. He looked right at me. The other kids who were with him, they all ran. They got away with it. They were the real little monsters. I've always wondered if your mom, if she was one of them. He told me to go home and ask her. Just ask her if his story was the truth. The walk back felt like a dream. The world had tilted on its axis, and everything I thought was solid had turned to sand. I got home, and my mom was passed out on the couch. I waited until morning. When she came into the kitchen, hungover and squinting against the light, I just asked her. I didn't yell. I just said, Silas Crowley says he only shot Mike twice. That's all it took. She didn't have to say a word. The way her face just collapsed. The way she couldn't look me in the eye. The truth was right there, uglier than any lie she'd ever told. Something in our house broke for good that night, something that could never be fixed. We stayed in that little house for another year before I left for good, but we never really spoke about it, or much of anything else. We just became 2 strangers living under the same roof, surrounded by a suffocating fog of things we could never, ever say out loud. Back in 2002, my boyfriend, Mark, and I were driving from Chicago out to a place called Dry Town, North Dakota, to see his folks. Man, that drive is a special kind of boring. It's just this endless, hypnotic ribbon of gray asphalt cutting through a sea of green corn for hours and hours. You start to feel like you're not even moving. Then all of a sudden, the whole world just changed. We hit a stretch where everything, and I mean everything, was black. A wildfire must have torn through there. The air even tasted different, like old ash. The sky was this hazy, washed-out gray, and the silence was deafening without the rustle of corn stalks. It was in the middle of this bizarre, apocalyptic landscape that I saw them. 2 little figures way off the road, looking like a mirage shimmering against the charred dirt. A tall, older man and a little kid. It was so out of place, so surreal, that I couldn't look away. I remember pointing them out to Mark, just as something to break the monotony. As we got closer, the details started to sharpen up, pulling them from a blurry suggestion into real people. The old man was wearing those classic farmer overalls, faded and worn, looking like he'd been born in them. The little boy next to him was like a single spot of color in that whole black and white world. He had on a bright blue t-shirt, clean white sneakers, and this messy mop of curly blonde hair that bounced a little with each step. They were holding hands, just walking along the edge of this burnt-out field. It was almost a sweet picture, you know, like a grandpa and his grandson out for a walk. But something felt off. The closer we got, the more a knot started to twist in my stomach. Then, just as our car was about to pass them, I saw it. It happened so fast, yet it's burned into my memory in slow motion. The old man didn't hesitate. He just scooped the boy up, not like a hug, but rough like a sack of potatoes, and without breaking stride, he heaved him over the side of this stone-lined hole in the ground. Oh well, I saw the flash of the boy's white sneakers disappear into the darkness, and then they were gone. I think I screamed. I'm not sure. My own voice sounded distant, like it was coming from somewhere else. Oh my God, Mark, did you see that? Stop the car. I was frantic, clawing for my cell phone in my purse, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold it. Of course, there was no signal. Just that useless, no-service message staring back at me. Mark was slowing down, looking at me like I'd lost my mind. See what, babe? It was just some farmer out on his land. He hadn't seen it. He'd been looking at the road. I felt this wave of pure, cold panic wash over me. We had to do something. We drove like maniacs until the charred fields finally gave way to a tiny, dusty town that looked like it hadn't changed in 50 years. We screeched to a halt in front of the first place we saw that was open, a little diner called Beth's Kitchen. I burst through the door, a mess of tears and babbling, and begged the woman behind the counter to let me use her phone to call 911. The whole place, all 5 people in it, just stopped and stared. The 911 operator was calm, which somehow made me feel even more hysterical. I tried to explain what I saw, between sobs, describing the burnt field, the old man, the little boy with the blonde curls. The whole diner was silent, listening to my side of the conversation. When I hung up, a heavy-set man in a trucker hat swiveled on his stool. Them burnt fields, that'd be Denton Shaw's property, he said, his voice a low rumble. Everyone else just nodded slowly, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Yeah, that's Denton's land, another one chimed in. He's always got his grandson with him. They weren't talking with alarm, more like they were solving a simple riddle. It was chilling. They knew exactly who I was talking about. It felt like I'd stumbled into a play where everyone knew their lines but me. We just sat there in this thick, soupy silence, waiting for the law to show up, and I felt like every eye in the place was dissecting me, the frantic outsider who was making a scene. When the county sheriff finally arrived, he didn't exactly rush in. He was an older guy with a gut that strained the buttons on his uniform, and he walked with the kind of weary slowness of a man who didn't like surprises. He listened to my story, nodding, but his eyes were full of doubt. He even suggested that the heat and the light on the black fields could play tricks on your eyes. Then he made a call, right there in the diner. Yeah, Denton got a lady here, says she saw something funny out on your land. No, I know. Okay. He hung up and turned to me. Well, that was Denton Shaw. Says he hasn't been near those fields all day. I begged him, pleaded with him to just go out there with us, to look in the well. He sighed and eventually came back with what he called good news. The well was empty. And better yet, Denton Shaw was on his way down to the diner with his grandson, just to put my mind at ease. He said it with this patronizing little smile, like he'd just solved a child's misunderstanding. The diner door swung open, and in walked a man who looked like he was carved out of granite. He was tall, weathered, and his eyes were chips of ice. This had to be Denton Shaw, and holding his hand was a little boy. But my blood ran cold. It wasn't him. It wasn't the same boy. This kid had dark, stick-straight hair, cut short and neat. His face was pale and serious. There were no blonde curls, no bright blue shirt. I jumped up. That's not him. That's not the boy I saw. I shouted, pointing. Denton Shaw glared at me, his face turning a dark red. The sheriff stepped between us. His friendly, tired old cop act was gone. His voice was hard as stone. Ma'am, he said, low and dangerous, you have two choices. You and your boyfriend can get in your car and leave my county right now, or I'm arresting you for filing a false report and slandering a good man's name. Mark was grabbing my arm, pulling me toward the door, whispering, let's just go, please. And in that moment, looking at the cold eyes of the sheriff, the rage in Denton Shaw's face, and the blank, empty stare of that little boy, I knew we weren't in a town. We were in a secret, and we had to get out. My mom has a strong Peruvian heritage, and in my early 20s, I figured it was about time I actually connected with that side of myself instead of just hearing her stories about it. So, I saved up some cash from my crappy waiting tables job and decided to do a big solo trip, starting in Colombia and working my way down. The whole thing felt like a movie, you know? I rented this beat-up little sedan, the kind with vinyl seats that stick to your legs in the heat, and just hit the road. I was out in the countryside, somewhere between two towns I couldn't pronounce, with the Andes looking like jagged purple teeth in the distance. The air was thick and smelled like damp earth and something sweet, maybe sugar cane. I had some local cumbia station crackling on the radio and the windows down, just feeling this incredible sense of freedom I'd never felt back home. I was just some guy, totally anonymous, on an adventure. It was perfect. I was thinking about where I'd stop for lunch, just completely lost in the moment, when the world behind me suddenly exploded in red and blue lights flashing in my rearview mirror. At first, I wasn't even scared, just annoyed. I figured I was going a little too fast, a typical tourist mistake. I pulled over to the dusty shoulder of the road, the gravel crunching under the tires, and started fumbling for my rental agreement and my passport in the glove box. I was already practicing my apologetic, broken Spanish in my head, but the cop who stomped up to my window wasn't interested in paperwork. He was a big guy, his uniform strained at the shoulders, and his face was all grim lines and sweat. Before I could even say hola, he was screaming at me in Spanish, words flying too fast for me to catch, but the tone was universal. And then I saw the gun. It wasn't in his holster, it was in his hand, pointed right at my face. The barrel looked like this huge, black, empty hole, and everything else just went blurry. My brain just short-circuited. All that feeling of freedom from 2 seconds ago evaporated, and was replaced by this cold, metallic dread that filled my entire chest. Manos, fuera del carro ahora, he yelled. My hands started shaking so bad I could barely get them up on the steering wheel where he could see them. This wasn't a speeding ticket. This was something else entirely. The next few minutes were a blur of rough hands and blinding panic. He yanked my car door open, and dragged me out onto the hot asphalt. Another officer was there, and they slammed me against the side of my dinky rental car, so hard the air shot out of my lungs. I felt the hot metal burn against my cheek. I tried to speak, to ask what was going on, to tell them they had the wrong guy, but my throat was closed up tight. All that came out was this pathetic little gasp. The click of the handcuffs as they bit into my wrists was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. They were cinched on so tight I could feel my pulse throbbing against the steel. They shoved me into the back of their truck, which smelled like stale cigarette smoke and body odor. As we sped away, I watched my little rental car get smaller and smaller on the side of that empty road, my half-eaten bag of chips still on the passenger seat. It felt like I was watching my old life disappear. The cops in the front were muttering to each other, and I'd catch a word here and there, dark, ugly words I didn't want to understand. I was just staring out the window, my mind a total blank slate of pure, undiluted terror. They took me to this crumbling, piss-yellow police station that looked like it was from another century. Inside, the air was heavy and smelled of disinfectant and despair. They didn't put me in an interrogation room or read me any rights. They just dragged me down a hallway and threw me into a small, windowless cell. The door slammed shut with a final, echoing boom that seemed to seal my fate. A little while later, a detective came to the bars. He wasn't yelling like the cops on the road. He was worse. He spoke slowly with this chilling calm, his eyes boring into me. And he started listing things, accusations. He kept using the same words over and over. Asesino, murderer, violator, rapist. He said I hurt children. Every word was like a physical blow. I tried to defend myself, my voice cracking. No, you don't understand. I'm an American tourist. Soy Americano. My name is. He just cut me off with a sneer, like he'd heard it all a million times before. He said my name, my actual name, was a lie. To them, I wasn't a person. I was a monster they had finally caught. And the worst part, the absolute scariest part, was this tiny, insane little voice in the back of my head that started to whisper. What if they're right? What if you did something and you don't remember? I don't know how long I was in that cell. Time just sort of melted into one long, continuous moment of dread. I sat on the filthy concrete floor, hugging my knees to my chest, just trying to breathe. Every sound in the station made me jump. A distant phone ringing, guards laughing down the hall, the clank of keys. I imagined my mom back in the States, wondering why I hadn't called. I pictured her getting a call from the embassy, telling her that her son was in a Colombian prison, accused of the most horrible things imaginable. I was convinced my life was over. I was going to die in this place, thousands of miles from anyone who knew me, rotting in a cell for crimes I didn't commit, all because of some horrible cosmic mistake. I replayed every decision I'd ever made that led me to this specific road, on this specific day. It felt like I was a ghost already, watching the last few hours of my life play out from a distance. The hope I had when I arrived in this country felt like a cruel joke. There was no adventure. There was only this damp, dark room and the certainty that I would never leave it. Then just as suddenly as it started, it was over. The cell door clanged open, and a different officer, an older guy with a tired face, just jerked his head at me. Vamos, he said, his voice flat. I was so sure it was a trick, that they were taking me somewhere worse, that I could barely move my legs. I stumbled out into the hallway, blinking against the light. They led me back to the front desk, where the first cop, the one who pulled the gun on me, was standing there, not even looking at me. The older cop mumbled something about an error, a mistake in the paperwork. A mistake. My entire world had been turned upside down. I'd faced my own death, and to them, it was a clerical error. There was no apology, no explanation. They just handed me my wallet and passport, their faces blank and indifferent. It was almost more terrifying than the anger, the complete and utter disregard for me, for my life. I was just a piece of paper that got put in the wrong pile. I walked out of that station and into the blazing sun, my legs shaking, feeling like I'd just woken up from the world's most vivid nightmare. I was almost at the door, just wanting to get the hell out of there and never look back, when the older cop called out, "Oi, gringo." I froze, my heart leaping back into my throat. He beckoned me back to the desk with a crooked finger. He seemed almost apologetic, or maybe just trying to cover his ass. "Para que veas," he said. "So you see." He slid a grainy black and white photocopy across the counter. It was a wanted poster, and I found myself staring at my own face. It was me. The same dark hair, the same shape of the nose, the same jawline. Every detail was mine, but it wasn't me. I was almost at the door, just wanting to get the hell out of there and never look back, when the older cop called out, "Oi, gringo." I froze, my heart leaping back into my throat. He beckoned me back to the desk with a crooked finger. He seemed almost apologetic, or maybe just trying to cover his ass. "Para que veas," he said. "So you see." He slid a grainy, black and white photocopy across the counter. It was a wanted poster, and I found myself staring at my own face. It was me. The same dark hair, the same shape of the nose, the same jawline. Every detail was mine. But it wasn't me. The eyes were different. Mine are just, regular eyes. These eyes were flat, dead, and filled with a kind of coldness that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was like looking at myself in a broken mirror, at a version of me that had taken a horribly wrong turn in life. This was the man they were looking for. The asesino. The violator. The man I shared a face with. That was the day I learned that true terror isn't about monsters or ghosts. It's about realizing that the one thing you own, your own identity, can be a death sentence, and that somewhere out there, a perfect copy of you is living a nightmare you could step into at any second. My worst day was a Sunday in 1993, in the small town of Port Tranquil, Georgia. The name's a bitter joke looking back. That night, I was stuck on desk duty at the Byrd County Sheriff's Office, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant, listening to the crickets buzz outside. It was one of those dead slow shifts where you start counting the cracks in the ceiling tiles just to stay awake. Then the radio crackled to life, spitting out codes that made the hair on my arms stand up. The dispatcher's voice was tight, trying to stay calm but failing. 10 codes for an armed subject for multiple 10-7S. That's out of service, the code we use for a dead body. The address was the Good Price Grocery, right off the main highway. A place I'd been to 100 times for a Coke and a bag of chips. We scrambled, piling into our cruisers, the silence of the night suddenly ripped apart by our sirens. We flew down those dark country roads in a convoy, our headlights cutting through the pine trees. Pulling up to the Good Price, the big, friendly-looking sign was still lit up, but the parking lot was dark and empty. It looked peaceful asleep, but we knew that inside, something awful had woken up. The 911 call had come from a survivor, somebody wounded and hiding, who could barely get words out between gasps of pain. We didn't know what we were walking into, if the shooter was still inside, if he had hostages. We set up a perimeter and went in hard and fast, a tactical entry through the front glass doors. The first thing that hit you wasn't a sound, but a smell. The sharp, coppery stench of blood mixed with the chemical sweetness of floor cleaner. It was so thick you could almost taste it. And then we saw it. Under the cold, humming fluorescent lights, there was a smear of red across the otherwise pristine linoleum floor. It wasn't a puddle, it was a trail, like someone had tried to drag themselves somewhere. We followed it, our boots squeaking on the clean floor, our guns raised. The trail led from the back of the store, down the canned goods aisle, all the way to a payphone near the front entrance. That's where we found the first one, a member of the cleaning crew, a kid barely out of high school, holding a bloody rag to his stomach and shaking uncontrollably. He was the one who made the call. He just pointed toward the back of the store, his eyes wide with a kind of horror you never unsee. We moved cautiously toward the stockroom in the back, stepping over knocked-over displays of cereal boxes and toilet paper. The silence in there was different. It was heavy-weighted. Pushing open the swinging doors to the stockroom, the scene was just wrong. It was something my brain couldn't immediately process. 5 people were on the floor, tangled together in a way that didn't make sense. At first, it just looked like a pile of limbs. Then your eyes start to pick out the details. The manager, a guy I knew named Frank. The young woman who always worked the checkout counter. 2 other janitors. 3 of them weren't moving at all. One was moaning softly, blood pooling beneath her. And then there was the 5th person, another member of the cleaning crew, sitting against a stack of pallets, untouched. He wasn't bleeding, not physically, but he was staring straight ahead, his face a complete blank, like his soul had just been scooped out. And tied around their wrists and ankles, binding them together, were brand new dog leashes, the bright nylon colors, red, blue, green, a sickeningly cheerful detail in the middle of all that death. He'd just grabbed them off the shelf in aisle 7. It took a while to get the story out of the survivor, the one who wasn't physically hurt. His voice was a monotone, like he was reciting a movie plot instead of something that had happened 10 feet away from him. He said after they locked the doors for the night, this man just appeared, came walking out of the pet food aisle like he belonged there. He had a gun, but he was calm, methodical. He didn't yell. He just pointed the gun at the cashier and quietly told her to take him to the office. He made the manager open the safe, and he scooped up a few thousand in cash and money orders, stuffing them into a canvas bag. At that point, it was just a robbery. A bad one, but one they'd all lived through. They did exactly what he said. No one played hero. But then, with the money in the bag, the guy didn't leave. That was the moment everything changed. Instead of running, he herded all of them, the manager, the cashier, the three-person cleaning crew, into the stockroom. He was in no hurry. He was in complete control. That's when the real nightmare began. The survivor said the man walked back out into the store, calm as you please, and came back a minute later with an armful of dog leashes from the pet aisle. He made them bind each other's hands and feet. Then he gave them the most insane order I've ever heard. He told them to stack up, to lie on top of one another in pairs. They were terrified, confused, but they did it, piling onto the cold concrete floor. The gunman looked down at this pile of human beings he'd made, and he said, his voice just a normal conversational tone, "God forgive me for what I'm about to do." And then he raised his pistol and started shooting, firing methodically into the pile of bodies. The stockroom filled with gunpowder and screams. After a couple of shots, though, there was just a click. The gun either jammed or ran out of ammo. But he wasn't done. He just turned around, went into a small maintenance closet, and came back out with a utility knife. One of the victims, a young man whose brother was also in the pile, started pleading with him. The killer asked him, "If you live, will you tell the police who I am?" The kid, through tears and blood, shook his head no. He was just trying to survive. But the killer didn't believe him, or maybe he just didn't care. He knelt and started stabbing the kid, over and over, with this terrifying, focused rage. He cut his throat so violently that the blade of the utility knife snapped off in his neck. The whole time, the killer was talking, rambling about how he used to be a cop, how he'd been fired, and this was his payback. After he was done with the kid, he stood up, breathing hard, and looked at the one survivor he hadn't touched. He walked over to him, got right in his face, and said, "I'm gonna let you live." And then he just turned and walked out, disappearing into the night with the money, leaving one man alive to tell the story of what he'd done, a living message of his cruelty. We never caught him. The whole thing was a ghost story from the start. The Good Price Grocery, a place trying to save a buck, had a security camera system, but it was busted. Had been for months. So we had no footage. All we had was the survivor's description of the man, and he was so traumatized he could barely form a coherent picture. All he could remember for sure were two details that have haunted me ever since. The man had a slightly crooked nose, like it had been broken once, and he had hazel eyes. That's it. A crooked nose and hazel eyes. You have any idea how many men in Georgia fit that description? We chased down leads for years. Every disgruntled ex-cop in a 3-state radius got a look. Every two-bit crook with a similar MO got hauled in. But it all led nowhere. It was like the guy materialized in aisle 7 out of thin air, and then just vanished from the face of the earth, leaving nothing behind but bodies and a story that curdles your blood. He's still out there. Or maybe he's dead. We'll never know. But some nights, when it's quiet, I can still smell the blood and the bleach, and I see a pair of hazel eyes staring out of the dark. I grew up in Stoner's Mill Township, Ohio, the kind of rural place where everyone knows your family tree, and the biggest news is usually about a prize-winning pig at the county fair. It was a conservative community, quiet and deeply rooted in its ways. We weren't Amish, but we were close cousins in culture, simple living, hard work, and a faith that was supposed to be as solid as the bedrock under our farms. Life had a predictable rhythm, but on October 2nd, 2006, that rhythm was shattered into a million pieces. I was a senior in high school, and I remember I was in my own classroom across the county when the news started to trickle in. But the real horror began for me personally when my little brother, who was only in 3rd grade at the one-room schoolhouse down the road, came flying through our front door. He wasn't just crying, it was this awful, ragged screaming, his face pale and streaked with tears. He collapsed into my mom's arms, babbling about a man in his classroom. A man with a gun, he kept saying, and chains and hooks. That's the detail that will forever be burned into my mind. Not just a gun. Hooks. A simple, agricultural tool turned into a word of absolute terror. We pieced together the story later, from the police, from the other kids, from the nightmares my brother would have for years. The man was Samuel Evans. We knew him. Not well, but we knew him. He was the milk tanker driver, the guy who came around to the local farms, a familiar face in a familiar truck. Around 10:30 that morning, he pulled that big silver truck up to the schoolhouse. He walked in, all smiles and familiar overalls, and asked the teacher, a young woman barely older than me, if he could borrow a hitching pin for his truck. A totally normal, neighborly request. She said of course. And then he came back inside. But this time, he wasn't holding a hitching pin. He was holding a pistol. He told everyone to be quiet and do exactly as he said. And then he did the most surreal, twisted thing. He pointed at the boys, my brother included, and forced them to help him. He made these little 8- and 9-year-old kids go out to his truck and help him unload his arsenal. A shotgun, a stun gun, bags of tools, planks of wood, and those goddamn metal hooks. They were just kids, too scared to do anything but obey, turned into unknowing accomplices in their own potential murder. Somehow, in the confusion, the teacher managed to slip out a back door and run to a neighboring farm to call 911. Evans must have realized she was gone, because that's when he decided his time was running out. He barricaded the front door with the wooden planks he'd made the boys carry in. The whole situation became a hostage crisis. But he wasn't interested in all the hostages. He let 3 parents who were there visiting, one of them pregnant, leave. And then he told all the boys to get out. My brother said he just pointed to the door and screamed at them to run and not look back. Then he was alone with the girls. 10 little girls, all under the age of 13. He made them line up against the chalkboard, their backs to the colorful alphabet posters and drawings of autumn leaves. He got on the phone with the 911 dispatcher, the police now surrounding the little schoolhouse, and said that if they came any closer, he would start executing the children. The police later told us that on the tapes, you could hear 2 of the girls' sisters begging him to shoot them first so they could die together. It felt like an eternity, standing out on the road with the other families, watching the flashing lights paint the trees red and blue, hearing nothing but the wind and the frantic squawk of police radios. Then we heard it, a series of sharp cracks that weren't firecrackers. It was a sound that didn't belong there, a sound that ripped a hole in the world. The shooting started from inside, and the state troopers went in hard. We just stood there, helpless, praying to a God that suddenly felt very far away. When the police finally breached the barricade, they found a scene from hell. Samuel Evans was on the floor, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot to the head. He'd used the last moments of his life not to repent, but to try and call his wife to say goodbye. The little girls were on the floor around him. He had shot 10 of them, methodically, one by one, as they stood against that blackboard. Only 4 of them survived that day. The forensics told an even sicker story. Evans had started with the handgun, but partway through his massacre, he switched to the shotgun. The investigators said it was a deliberate choice. A handgun is one thing, but a shotgun, that's for maximum damage. That's for creating a scene so horrific that it can never be scrubbed clean from your memory. It wasn't just murder, it was an act of pure, calculated defilement. And then we found the notes he left behind, his pathetic attempt at an explanation. He was a man drowning in his own filth. The notes confessed that,